Hi, it's my total pleasure to welcome you to the first day of the first Parapraxis and Psychosocial Foundation Seminar 1 on the problem of the family in psychoanalysis. I'm Hannah Zeven, and I'm the founding editor of Parapraxis and the co-director with Alex Colston, who's on this call, of the Psychosocial Foundation. And we're hosted by these two groups, Parapraxis, which is a new popular magazine of psychoanalysis on the left, coming later this year, and the Psychosocial Foundation, a nonprofit educational organization that exists to advance our understanding of where the social, political, and psychological converge. We decided to make a seminar in this form because it's extremely hard to think and to think about the family, or as Alex Colston calls it, the thorniest thicket in psychoanalysis, as well as beyond it. And it's notoriously difficult, as Emmy O'Brien, who's also on this call, says, it's hard to know exactly what one might mean by the family, where it has all these valences. It's a space of protection against the assaults of daily life under racialized capital, but it's also a site of violence itself. And it's very easy to go quickly from the family to my family, and especially today, maybe when it's Mother's Day and many feelings come up on this day. So together we're going to read from now until November some classical approaches to psychoanalysis and the family, as well as sociology of the family, theories of family liberation, Freudian-Marxist critique, Black feminist critiques of the family, and so on. And we're so lucky that many have been really kind of movingly generous with their time and energy. So thank you to all of our facilitators, who you'll get to meet shortly, and to all of our presenters today, Donald Moss, and of course to all of you for joining in. We're so excited to learn with you for the next 5-6 months. So before I turn things over to Wendy, I also want to especially thank Michelle O'Brien and Wendy Lauderman, who have co-organized this seminar with me. I've learned so much from you already. It's been kind of mind-blowing. Two very basic Zoom technicalities, just in case this is new to you. We're going to be in breakout groups after Dr. Moss presents and answers some questions. You will be invited to join a specific breakout room. You'll just click that you accept the invitation. And when it's time to leave, you'll exit the breakout room, but not hang up the Zoom call. That's technicality number one. Material reality. Psychic reality. If for some reason you want to leave your room because there's a clinical conflict or so on, just come back to the main room and I'll reassign you. No questions asked. Okay, we'll be trying to be responsive to the chat as well. Feel free to introduce yourselves here. We'll do that again in the chat, maybe in breakout rooms, but for now I'm going to turn it over to Wendy Lauderman. Thank you all so much.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Happy Mother's Day to those who celebrate, to Hannah and Emmy, for instance. Okay, so the structure of today's and ostensibly all forthcoming sessions will be that Donald will present first, then there will be some room for questions for Don that you can put in the chat. Then we'll break out into breakout groups and return and kind of share what came up in those conversations. So just a few opening remarks. First of all, thank you so much, Hannah and Emmy, and really everyone who showed up. It's so heartening to see this many people who want to read these materials. Just a kind of note on reading, although this may be obvious for everyone. I teach undergraduates, so usually there's some resistance to the text, and I'm always thinking in a sort of paranoid way, how do I get people to be open to the material? And there's something so nice about returning to these Freud texts, because he really is one of the greatest thinkers of ambivalence, of hatred and love at the same time. And I think we really just want to encourage a generous approach to the text in a way that's sort of solicited by Freud's writing itself. He's very generous to his interlocutors, extremely aware of ambivalence, and also there was this one quote in a footnote when he was trying to think the fraternal clan in a way that had not yet been covered by the anthropologists with whom he was in dialogue, and he said, it would be as foolish to aim at exactitude in such questions as it would be unfair to insist upon certainty. So that's sort of the spirit with which we're approaching Freud's essays. So with that, I will introduce and then turn things over to Don. So we're so grateful to have Don here today. His work is also very much in line with the approach of the magazine and the seminar and the foundation, which is kind of trying to think the Freud-Marx problem, which he's been doing for since 1975. So I don't know the math there, but he's been in full-time clinical practice of psychoanalysis for 40 years and has been trying to illuminate how combined psychic and historical realities inform and limit our capacities to imagine and realize liberated futures. His books have broadly explored hate-based ideation and include collections and books include Hating in the First Person Plural from 2003, 13 Ways of Looking at a Man, 2012, At War with the Obvious, 2017, and forthcoming in July, Psychoanalysis in a Plague Year, which I'm very much looking forward to. So thank you, Don. Thank you everyone for coming, and make sure to put your questions in the chat for Don.
Okay. Well, thank you to everybody. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Hannah. And thank you to all of you. I have to say, I approached this with some trepidation. I'm going to be speaking in a minute or two about freedom and structure and the problems in relation to the two. And part of the trepidation I feel right now, I think, represents in a very, very mild way the difficulty. For instance, right now I feel an excess of freedom. I wish that there were more structure. I wish I were being told what to do. I wish there were questions in advance that I could respond to. And there are not. I don't know any of you. I have no sense of context. I have no sense of what a success would be. I have no sense of what a failure would be. I have no sense of anything except a kind of loneliness that is disturbing. And that kind of loneliness that is disturbing, I think in some way will lurk in whatever I have to say in the next 18 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to begin now. I've got a sort of semi-structured text that I wrote, a few pages, and I'm going to be reading some things that I've written, and then I'll pause and try to associate to those things. Okay, here we go. I'll offer a way of thinking about the Freud we've just read. I do not plan to do anything like a direct reading, but rather to speak about my sense of what the texts tell us about Freud, in quotation marks, a figure of whom Auden famously said, not so much a person, but a climate of opinion. As in all of Freud, each of these texts is centered on the problems linked to the human aspiration for freedom, to the possibilities lurking in our common wish for liberation from unjust tyranny. Each text arrives at the same conclusion, that as we work to liberate ourselves from the figures and structures of our families, we simultaneously and inadvertently are helpless to evade the replication of both those figures and those structures. So let me pause with that assertion. I think this is a central notion of Freud from the project to his death, that he gives enormous respect to the undying wish for liberation from gratuitous strictures, and simultaneously to the undying presence of those strictures that he never feels can be can dissolve or be eradicated, and that he locates the human individual and group psychic structures precisely between, and not quite tragically, but melancholically between forces of aspiring toward freedom, let's say on the left, and ineradicable structuring, limiting, even punishing forces on the right. And the centerpiece of his argument, and it's an argument, let's say, with Marx, is that these structures that, which I've metaphorically just placed on the right, are ineradicable, that they will persist no matter how forceful and intelligent the pursuit of freedom might ever be. This puts Freud, of course, in direct opposition to whatever one means by Marx, let's say for the moment, also in quotation marks. Freud's texts are ostensibly about family and kinship structures. On one end, in family romances, he aims to illuminate the restrictive force of our original infantile romance, the binding force of love, the inevitable eruption of hate, and the necessity to negotiate the two. How to maintain loving ties to a figure we want to eradicate. This romantic mixture of love and hate continuously binds us to what we once were. I think this is the central message of the family romance paper, that we are continuously bound to what we once were by the, what's the word, inerasable, that can't be a word, ineradicable ties of love above all else. That's on one end, family romance. In Totem and Taboo, Freud focuses on the inevitable failures of patricide as a solution. Patricide represents the most blunt effort to eradicate the restrictive force of the infantile, to free ourselves from the tyranny of restriction and limit by destroying the tyrannizing and limiting figure of what he calls the father. So the texts are ostensibly about family and kinship structures, but more deeply, I think, they are about Freud's notion of individual and group psychic structure, about what happens internally when, no matter how successfully, we have indeed shaken off and rid ourselves of external shackles. What happens to us internally when we, let's say, rid ourselves of unjust, tyrannical authority? Freud will insist, again, I think throughout, 50 years of writing, that the elimination of external authority represents not only a partial solution, but in fact may worsen things. That paradoxically for Freud, the elimination of external authority may in fact intensify the restrictions of internal authority, internal punitive authority. I think lurking in, not said in quite such a dense one sentence way, I think this is the theme of Totem and Taboo. So I think that I know that maybe Hannah has said that this today was meant to be addressing the myth of the family. I don't think Freud's text actually finally, I don't think he cares very much about the myth of the family. I think what he cares about more so is the myth of the possibility of a freed individual, or the myth of the possibility of freedom. And I think in a certain way, he uses the family as a metaphor for all the complex binding forces that for him make freedom an ever receding aspiration, one that can never be realized. The freed individual, the one that can never be realized, I think, for Freud, is the one who has successfully liberated themselves from their infantile past. For Freud, the fully liberated individual will be the one who had successfully evaded infancy, who had been born into autonomy. The limits of liberation for Freud are bound to the persistence of the infantile. It's not the family that limits the individual. It is irreducible psychic structure that limits the individual. Though not directly expressed here, Freud's notion of freedom and autonomy would be the freedom and autonomy to regulate tension states as one wishes, to control states of tension, to eliminate tension when I want it eliminated, to modulate it when I want it modulated, to increase it, decrease it as I want it increased and decreased, to have access to those figures. Freud calls them objects. In the text we've read, he calls them mothers and fathers. To have access to those figures whom one feels will be the most effective vehicles by which tension states can be managed. Pleasure for Freud comes from the effective management of states of tension. Therefore, for Freud, freedom equals the capacity to pursue and find pleasure in whatever form one wants it. Tyrannical force is force that interferes with one's pursuit of pleasure, force which generates tension states that we cannot control. And what makes it tyrannical is the notion that the source of tyranny itself has limitless access to pleasure. So Freud situates each of us in a jealous relation to the object of tyranny or the objects of tyranny. There's a notion that the tyrant has limitless access to pleasure, and we, on the other hand, our access to pleasure is limited by the presence and what's the word for it? Executive, the execution of tyranny by the tyrant. The tyrant alone has autonomous access to pleasure, and our sources of pleasure depend on complying with the structures and limitations established outside our will and beyond our control by the tyrant. So for Freud, when we internalize tyrannical objects, we are therefore internalizing the source of tension states we cannot control. He also makes it clear in these two texts that the internalization of those tyrannical objects is a necessity for establishing our own individual subjective structure. So I don't know the proper word for it. It's not a tragedy, it's a kind of dilemma. We are internalizing the very tyranny in order to become coherent enough to wish for freedom. We must have previously internalized the tyrannical structures that allow us to be autonomous enough to wish to overthrow them. I hope that is clear. It's as though we have to swallow the father to, have the celebratory paternal meal in order to establish our own individual structure. But in swallowing the father, our internal structure is forever compromised by the tyranny of the ineradicable internalization of that self-same father. I think the key thing there, I think it's lurking in both of the texts, is that internalization or identification, or, you know, in the totem and taboo, literally the swallowing of, the eating of, the tyrannical, hyper-regulating figures, is the requirement for individual psychic structure. Individual psychic structure is the requirement for a wish for freedom. But the wish for freedom would include the wish to be rid of tyrannical structure, which finally leads to wanting to be rid of one's own self-structure, which one has achieved only, ironically, by internalizing that from which one wants freedom. I hope that's not as clumsy as it sounded. In some deep sense, then, Freud argues that patricide is suicide. I think that's a very important point for Freud, that the elimination of the tyrant finally would, were it successful, demand the elimination of the self. And I think people like Norman O'Brown kind of took that argument very seriously, and others have as well. That and Leo Bersani, the recently passed away Leo Bersani, also took that argument very seriously, and therefore located freedom with dissolution of the ego, which for him, it wouldn't be suicide, but the dissolution of the ego. Let's not, for the moment, talk about ego. I don't think it's in either one of the texts that we read. How much time do I have? Maybe 5 minutes, is that right? Can somebody clue me in?
Yes, Don.
5 minutes, okay. I want to say, so this aim to eliminate tyranny, I think that for Freud, since it cannot be realized actually, nonetheless, the wish to eliminate tyranny, the wish to eliminate all that interferes with our capacities to regulate and have access to pleasure on our terms, can readily be turned not against the primal figure, tyrannical figure, but can be displaced onto targetable groups. So it's not the tyrannical father whom I mean to exultantly and ceremoniously rid the world of, but rather it's people of color, or gay people, or trans people, or women, or etc. That is where, what I mean to say there is that it becomes a kind of lazy and efficient mode of displacement to locate tyranny in these easily identifiable, perceptible groups, and to rejigger the wish for freedom and autonomy from the impossible task of killing off the internalized tyrant to what can feel like the very possible task of the final solution of eradicating the world of the tyrannical presence of women, Jews, etc. And I think it's a very, for me, this has been an important feature of my work for a long time now, that notion of turning the source of tyranny from the impossibly internalized and necessary figure of the self-tyrannizing presence to this displaced set of figures, the external ones I've just given name to. I'm wondering, actually, it wouldn't be that bad to stop here. If I have a few fewer words to say, that might mean that we can extend by whatever the saved minutes, we can extend the question period, which would provide me with a little bit of structure, which I'm very eager to get. So let me stop here and hope that will prompt some questions and prompt some thoughts. So let me do that.
Thank you, Don. That was great. I just want to remind everyone, feel free to put questions in the chat. I don't see any yet. I do have one, but I also want to, if anyone wants to raise their hand, I can also take questions that way, but feel free to put them in the chat. I guess in the absence of anyone burning to ask something, a question that I have for you would be that there's a lot of talk in Totem and Taboo about social reproduction and the role of the tyrant father insofar as he's a figure for the child, but not perhaps as much about the father qua father or what happens when one becomes a parent oneself, and where the place of the tyrant is, and when one sort of assumes that position. And the two sort of open questions that he seemed to leave by the end of the essay were, how much can we attribute to psychical continuity in the sequence of generations, and what are the ways and means employed by one generation in order to hand on its mental states to the next one? And it occurs to me that with Freud, often it is really this, like the knowledge is really produced in the service of understanding the child's psychic development. But I'm sort of curious if you have anything to say about how one manages the existence of the tyrannical when one becomes a parent or is in adult relations that have moved beyond the child position.
Your question, the heart of your question is the phrase "how one manages." Is that right?
Yes, or the place of the tyrant, I suppose, in the older member of the family, yes, psychically.
Yes. Well, so I would say that there's a wide range of management techniques available to one in relation to dealing with the tyrant from the now tyrannical position, as opposed to the once tyrannized position. It seems to me that the word manage might overstate the degree of control one has over that task. I think many of us might hope to have full management control over that task and to recognize, to diminish as close to zero as possible one's the pleasures of tyrannizing and turning the tables. But I think that without being too universal about it, I think that one is in for a lot of surprises in relation to that moment. One may think whatever about how one will be and how one will manage, but I think that we just don't know in advance what will be the effects of these internalized figures on us, since since their presence is not manageable. Our efforts to manage are always going to be one step too late. The tyrannical figures will make themselves evident, and then we manage, and then we manage, and then we manage. We're always managing an effect which has just happened. I don't think we're as in control as we would like to be in preventing the effects from happening, which would be my sense of totally successful management.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna take questions first from the chat, and then from the hands that were raised as well. So the first question from Deborah Kim, can you expand a bit on the last part about not putting everything on marginalized folks? That you mentioned not putting everything on people of color, trans people, queer people, etc.
This is a question to me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, I thought
everything is a question to you, Don.
No, I thought you
right
were
now.
just asking the questioner to restate their question. So the question is, why am I putting it all on marginalized people? Is that
No. Your invocation of not displacing, or maybe just I don't know, Deborah, if you want to ask the question, you're also welcome to do so.
It just went too quick for me, so I just wanted to like catch it because it seemed really important what you were saying, and I just missed the concept.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, good. I'm sorry. Yeah, it was. I said it very quickly. Totem and taboo, in a sense, is a way of saying, not so fast, brothers. You think you're going to solve this that way? Well, it doesn't work. You're not going to be freed of the tyrannical father by, no matter what kind of homicidal schemes you come up with. And the reason you will not be is that the tyrannical father has already, you're always too late. The tyrannical father has taken residence inside. So let's take that as though it were so. Then for the rest of us who are not participating in, at least directly, in paternal meals, we may well look for alternatives to the inevitable failure of trying to kill the tyrant. And as such, we may look in a lazy and very efficient way for targetable, there's not a word for it, people of whom we can claim that they are the source of tyranny, and that were the world only rid of them, the world would be rid of tyranny. So we get rid of tyrannical Jews, we get rid of tyrannizing women, we get rid of etc. So that whenever marginalized people are targeted, I think it's always the case that the vision of the targeting figures is a world freed of tyranny. And so that's what I meant to say.
Thank you. Okay, so can you speak a bit more to Freud's treatment of guilt? For Freud, guilt also precedes morality, religion, etc. Freud doesn't explain in this text what the impetus of guilt might be. Is this an instinct? Is it an instinct? And that comes from Arij Elmi.
Well, I think that the word guilt, as we use it, just if we say, oh, I feel guilty, it refers to an affect, like I feel guilty. I think for Freud, the word guilt also represents a formal structure, not only a feeling, but a formal structure that is the relation between two internal structures. An object relation, on one side, the punitive presence of a punitive tyrannical presence which forbids assault on punitive tyrannical presences. On the other side, the impulse to assault and get rid of the tyrannical presence. So it's a relational notion that can generate feelings of guilt, but what it really generates is a source of irreducible tension between two internalized objects. It's the internal source of tension that precedes any experience of guilt. Guilt gives a name to an otherwise nameless internal source of tension. So guilt is an afterward notion, trying to name and capture a sense of tension that can't otherwise be reduced. Guilt it's a nice notion because the moment I feel guilty, at least in principle, I can, what's it called when you, what's that word? When you expiate? Expiate. I can expiate. The moment I can say I am guilty, at least in principle, I have the power to expiate my guilt. Thus, the totem meal, thus, whatever it is. And I think for Freud, no matter what effort at expiation, the sense of tension is irreducible.
Sorry, I had posed the question. I'm wondering if I could rephrase it. I mentioned in the comment about Melanie Klein, because she uses guilt in a particular way as well. So, and her intervention with Freud was that she made the superego earlier, the incorporation of it, and then an understanding that it's an incorporation of something that was already internally present. So I'm trying to understand what does Freud view guilt as then? Is it also an instinct, or am I understanding correctly that he views it as the incorporation through the superego?
It's not an instinct. I think that I think the difference between Freud and Klein in this regard has been exaggerated, because I think that fundamentally the only difference is a notion of at what moment does something arise. But I think for both, and this makes Freud an object relational person no less than Klein, for both, guilt is a structural relation between two sites of objects, internalized objects, and guilt is the manifestation of a irreducible tension between the wish to be rid of the internalized object and the necessity to preserve the internalized object. And whatever guilt is, it's the expression of the necessity. You cannot rid yourself of that object. It is wrong and also suicidal. And I think maybe Klein might emphasize the suicidal aspect of guilt, that by then saying it's attached to the death instinct, where Freud would diminish the suicidal dimension and stress instead its attachment to something like that has the ethics and morality. I think Klein is more inclined to point to, look, if you do this, you will kill yourself. Don't do it. Thus, the paranoid schizoid position, in which it's lose-lose. You lose if you're paranoid and you lose if you're schizoid. The best thing to do is get out of that position as quickly as you can, and onward to the depressive position, which I think locates Freud most of the time. Most of what he writes about is, one could say, an elaboration of the depressive position, the irreducible melancholy of being caught between love and hate.
Don, I think we have time for one more question before we break into small groups, and then we'll try to cover the rest of them, which are excellent, when we return. So there's one question that was posed and then echoed, which I will read from Thomas Clancy. I'm wondering if you could speak to your last point, but in the context of leftist revolutionary abolitionist struggles. Is there something different happening psychically when we work towards the abolition of oppressive structures, as opposed to displacing frustration around the impossibility of patricide onto marginalized groups? I'm curious about this, both in terms of literal revolutions against the oppressive class, as well as work towards the dismantling of oppressive structures in less literal / direct ways.
Well, this takes, I think this question takes us to Fanon more than to Freud. And I think, but not entirely, because Fanon doesn't renounce Freud. Of course, I think that there is a difference about which I care a great deal, as to what is being targeted, and that revolutionary movements that target the colonizer, let's say, to use Fanon's term, are, in my view, profoundly different from, let's give them revolutionary movements in their view that target marginalized communities. To target the colonizer includes imagining a future of a decolonized future. To be imagining that future and targeting the colonizer seems to me very much a movement toward liberation. I think it remains an open question whether decolonized structures are capable of realizing the futures whose imagination made them possible. I think it's an open question. Do we have liberated, decolonized structures to point to, about which we might be able to say, there, it worked? I'm not sanguine about that. I think that the post-colonial structures and their outcomes remain uncertain.
Great, thanks, Don. So we're, I think, at the point where we'll split up. Just want to reiterate that, or Hannah, do you want to just make some comments about the...
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So you'll go into groups now. You accept the invitation to join a breakout group if you want to. When you're in that group, if for any reason you want to leave, you just say exit the group. You'll come back to this screen where I will be sitting. And if you'd like to join a different group for any reason, no questions asked, I will put you in that another group, this so that there's a way to manage clinical conflict, etc. And then we'll be in these groups until 30 minutes till the hour of ending, depending on time zone. And I'll give you a heads up that we're rejoining this major group so that facilitators are aware to sort of wrap things up. Again, thanks so much to everyone, to Dawn, to Wendy, and to the facilitators. I'll go ahead and open the rooms now.
Okay, well, of course, I have a mild bias to hear the end of the sentence that was cut off when I came into this room, but which I think was really interesting. And we were talking about kind of in the absence of desiring to supersede or surpass in rank some sort of figure of authority or the tyrant, for those who really can't aspire in that direction, the desire to join a kind of and can't find meaning in that sort of vertical way, the desire for joining social movements as an alternative. And I'm curious, Suzanne, if you want to say anything more about that, because I was very interested, but you also don't have to, because this is a big group and maybe you'd rather not. But if you want to continue.
Yeah, it's okay. We were talking about the pessimism of Freud and about the inevitability of internalizing the tyrant. And so I'd opened up a question about, well, you know, Freud gives it as a given that there is a tyrant. And so what about psychological structure of people who don't live in a hierarchical society, and how would that look like? And then I talked a little bit more about my practice. I work with working class and lumpen young adults, and how difficult it is to escape that ambivalence of love and hate towards the tyrant, because obviously there's a lot of envy and desire to be like that, to have access to enjoyment and the pleasure that the tyrant has. But for working class young adults within the society, there's really, you know, unless somebody is lucky or has an incredible passion for something, or they're really, really, really smart about something, otherwise it's quite impossible to get out of that. And so that tension, that hate really, and envy towards the tyrant never goes away, because they don't have access to a meaningful life. And I was talking a little bit, how do I work with young adults like this? In the past, I always directed them, it's not a psychoanalytic technique, but I directed them towards social movements so that they wouldn't be alone. They would find meaning in the struggle. And that would usually be helpful. Right now, it's much more difficult since the pandemic. But I was both trying to be a little more optimistic in terms of, okay, if Freud thinking is a given that there's a hierarchical structure, and then obviously we're going to have then a psychic structure that reflects that. But can we imagine human beings who are grown in a more egalitarian society, and how that would look like? And then for working class young adults doing practice, how to help them out of, you know, that sense of hate and envy and sense of inferiority, as well as they struggle both in poverty and in a life that has no meaning, yet they're bombarded now with social media. It's just really awful on their phone, and they're constantly bombarded by the tyrant who has it better than them. So that was kind of outlines.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Yeah, so the floor is really open for anyone who wants to ask Don any more questions. He's still with us, and also to return to some of the questions from before we broke. But first, I'll just, if anyone has a question that came up in their group that they want to pose to Dawn. Maybe you can raise your hand and ask it directly. Oh, also Dawn, if you want to if you want to share some thoughts. I know you were in a group as well, so.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Julie, if you want to go for it.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Napolin. I know some of you, it's great to see you. Thank you, Professor Moss, for your great presentation. A question that was coming up in our group was, we were wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about how the oscillation between the paranoid and schizoid positions operates in the dynamic that you laid out. We think we got the hang of it, but it would be great to hear from you on this point.
Well, I think it lays out like this. You know, let's at the level of the paranoid schizoid, I think the best option is to eliminate consciousness. Now, failing that, which one does fail at, one is in a position of one is in a position of discomfort. That's the whole idea, that one cannot manage one's tension states by oneself. So, and there's an attribution. Why am I in pain or in discomfort? What is the source of my pain or discomfort? The paranoid answer to that question is, you are the source of my pain and discomfort. Okay, so the solution to that is to get rid of you. The schizoid, to actively flee from you. Now, successfully fleeing from you leaves me utterly alone. And in that sense, I could be called schizoid. The problem with being schizoid is that I have no access to anything that will diminish my tension states. So I get rid of you, I'm left alone and unable to regulate myself. I don't get rid of you and I'm left in a state of tension that I hold you responsible for. So both of these are untenable, let's say. And in a way, they generate the possibility of imagining suicide, literally eliminating myself. And in that direction toward the elimination of the very possibility of consciousness lies the emergence of theorizations of the death drive being a solution to the paranoid schizoid moment. Well, that's my sense of how it plays out.
Great. Thank you, Dawn. Will?
Yeah, I mean, this is maybe just a really broad question, but I feel like, and I was also in Suzanne's group, so this is sort of where I'm coming from, but like, so Dr. Moss, when you were speaking earlier, like the whole sort of question of the ambivalence of freedom and the ineradicable constraints that sort of get, I don't know, literalized or metaphorized as like the father, I just like, some of that felt very sort of regardless of your social situation or of the society or of the not, whatever, the human relations that you're in, like that ambivalence will persist. But then I think I guess my question is like, how much of that is shaped by the social structure that you're in. Like, I think we had a lot of questions in our group around like, well, what if you aren't in this like mother, father, dyad form? Or what if your like primal horde looks different or it's less hierarchical? Like, and this might just be a broad question about like the relation between the psychic and the social that I'm really new to all this and so wondering about, but yeah.
Well, I think this is the sort of bugaboo, the Freud-Marx bugaboo, your question. So what is there to do? So what there is to do is do our best to aspire toward egalitarian structures, external to the family, internal to the family, and to really aggressively aspire to achieve those structures. And to the extent that they are close to being achieved, to see, well, what do we have left? Do we have, when we have something approximating egalitarian structure, what happens to, let's say, hierarchical internal structure? Is it diminished? Does it maintain itself? Does it intensify? And these are askable questions. I mean, I've just asked them, but they're not only askable, but you could actually pay attention if you had some way of assessing how egalitarian a structure is. And I think you kind of can. There are egalitarianly structured families. And I think in general, you can make the prediction that in a really deeply egalitarian family structure, the likelihood of crippling internalized tyranny is reduced. I think that's true. I think it's probably true about social structures too, that diminish the tyrannical setup in the social structure, and you're likely to diminish the tyrannical internalization of such structures. But I think as best we can, Freud where is it? I think it's in Ego and the Id. He writes about the superego, which is a big part of what we're talking about without having yet named it. That what gets internalized, he says, is never the parent's conscious sense of morality and ethics, but rather the parental superego. So that in some sense, we are all helpless to control what we transmit to our offspring, because we're not in control of the structures, of the internal structures that constitute our superego. And Freud infers from that this is how intergenerational transmission of tyranny takes place. That is, even given liberal, egalitarianly minded parents, superego structures that are beyond our reach get transmitted, and we're helpless to stop that transmission. So it's, I mean, he's not, he's not a happy camper, Freud. He has a fairly bleak, but only, in my view at least, only fairly bleak. It isn't dismal. It's fairly bleak, and he wants us to be prudent and to not set things up so that we'll fail, and to not imagine possibilities that we're doomed to not achieve. I think he figures that this is worse for all parties concerned than if we set modest goals that allow for realizable aspirations. So I don't think he's gloomy. I think he's, whatever the word is, modest, and anti-Marxist, forcefully so. But that's for another day.
We'll get there. Hi, Emily. Go ahead.
Thanks. I think this is maybe related to the question that Will just asked, but routed maybe a little more directly towards the text. But in our group, we were talking about sort of an aside that Freud makes here, and I think it comes up also in group psychology, but the sort of temporary homosexuality of the exiled brothers, right? Like, so the question of that sort of exilic position, sorry, of the exiled position.
Oh, exilic.
Like,
I never heard that word before. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I might have just invented it, but the exiled position, and what the nature of that position. So there suddenly the lateral bonds, which are almost always imagined as rivalrous, are rewritten as homosexual, and have a different kind of tone and tenor to them. So one question was, why do the brothers come back at all? And then the other question, I think, is more broadly how to imagine that position, and then also the fact that here tyranny comes back because there's still the problem of divvying up the women, right? And here tyranny is figured as a monopoly on women. So the other question is also, what does it mean to take that as a model for all tyranny and oppression, the monopoly of women, and is all oppression, can we make analogy to that, or does it matter that the fantasy is a monopoly on women?
Well, I think that to leave it literally as a monopoly on women is to burden women with the responsibility to provide us with pleasure. And in that sense, that idea it could be a foundation for misogyny in general. That is, I hold women responsible for the fact that I am unable to find sources of pleasure. And it's so I hold the tyrant responsible for making a claim on those women, but I hold the women responsible for being, whatever the word is, drawn to the tyrant rather than to me. So I think women, there are a cipher for the entire category of thing that might provide me with pleasure and the capacity to regulate my own tension states. And in that sense, women are placed there in a very vulnerable way. It would be like, it was like people of color are there to provide me with the possibility of being able to regulate my own sources of pleasure. So it's the position that makes whoever is placed in that position vulnerable to being targeted as responsible for non-pleasure. Speaking of the family, our grandson is 3 inches away. He's just returned and may cause a ruckus within a few minutes.
I have a follow-up question to the idea of the woman as a cipher, relating to page 152 of Totem and Taboo, where Freud writes that the son's efforts to put himself in the place of the father god became ever more obvious. The introduction of agriculture increased the son's importance in the patriarchal family. He ventured upon new demonstrations of his incestuous libido, which found symbolic satisfaction in his cultivation of Mother Earth. And it was sort of one of the only places where the mother is invoked, except for when he says, perhaps the mother preceded, or the mother goddess preceded all of this, but doesn't say much more than that. And there was something about this I wonder if there's something analogous in the sort of proprietary relationship or the relationship to the woman and the land as property that could be said here, especially insofar as he says something earlier about the invention of private property that I'm not able to find right now, but I'm curious about how you read this sort of agricultural interpretation.
Well, I thought what you were getting at is climate change. And that in some sense, one could say that the turn toward Mother Earth, to the extent that it doesn't work out, that Mother Earth does not easily supply us with all that we want, leads to the targeting of Mother Earth in the same way that Mother as cipher might be targeted in what we were talking about before. So you have this resentful relation to Mother Earth, who has been tasked with the endless provision of pleasure and tension regulation. And failing that task, we simply double down on the violence which we visit upon her, and double down and feel entitled to do so, because it is she who has failed us, rather than we who have made it impossible for her to. Something like, I thought you were going in that direction.
That's helpful. Thank you. I appreciate that. Any other final questions before we end for the day? There were a couple that remain in the chat. Let's see. Oh yeah, Hannah, go ahead. Take it from here. Sorry.
No, so this has been so wonderful. The chat is super active, and there are lots of questions that I think will really move beautifully into next week's presentation. So I'm going to just do some closing remarks to help guide us through this. So firstly, thank you so much, Dawn, and to all the facilitators and to all of you for being here on this fraught day that marks the family. In 2 weeks from today, we're going to continue with the family complexes via Lacan, and Anna Fishzon, who's at IPTAR, a psychoanalyst, will be presenting. As a note, that of, I think it might be the only one, will not be recorded. So if that plays some kind of calculus into your, that particular Sunday, that's just good to know. The readings are already in the Google Drive. We will be collecting RSVP as we did before. As you can see, it's important, the RSVP, to give us a rough sense so we know how many of these facilitators to call in. So we really appreciate you doing that and doing it promptly. The only other 2 announcements I wanted to make is that before we meet again, like the day before we meet again, there will be, as part of the Psychosocial Foundation with Parapraxis, a conversation, the first in a conversation series on keywords in the psychosocial. And so that, like all of our events, is completely sliding scale from $0 up. And it will be featuring Stephen Frosch, Rosaria Martinez, and Samo Tomczyk, moderated by Alex Colston. And that is on May 21st. And I'm going to drop that into the chat. And then if you really didn't get enough of maternality, although it really just only kind of came up at the end, we also have a conversation on July 9th on the maternal with doctors Joy James, Lisa Baritzer, and Sarah Knott, and I'll be moderating that conversation as well. So if you want to sign up for those, again, totally sliding scale, we welcome you. And otherwise, we'll see you. Yeah, that's the question. Dawn says no. We'll see you in 2 weeks from today to talk about the family complexes in Lacan. Thank you so much, everyone, and stay in good touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.